Hello and welcome to our CalStateTEACH CalTPA Cycle 2 training session. Today we will be completing an overview of the Cycle 2 process as well as diving deep and taking a look at the first step of Cycle 2, which is the plan step. Again, let's look at the overview document. Now, this document can be found within the TPA Center within the assessment guidebook for CalTPA Cycle 2. Now, if you notice here, I just have the first two steps listed because those are the first two most important steps. And at this point, you should have already completed CalTPA Cycle 1. So I will let you know that the steps are similar and that they fall into the categories of Step 1, Plan, Step 2, Teach and Assess, Step 3, Reflect, and Step 4 is Apply. So that should sound familiar to you from already taking CalTPA Cycle 1. For the purposes of CalStateTEACH, when it comes to Cycle 2, you are asked to complete literacy lessons. Cycle 1 was mathematics, Cycle 2 is now literacy. So please keep that in mind as we're discussing and as you look at the documents within the guidebook, because they will go back and forth between saying literacy and mathematics. But for our program purposes, only pay attention to the fact that we are focusing on literacy for Cycle 2. You can see that when you look at the overview document, it will tell you what the cycle step is. It will tell you what you will be doing in a nutshell format, and then it tells you what evidence you need to submit for that cycle. Here's the place where you can find all of the resources that you need in order to complete CalTPA. This is the TPA Center on our course website. If you've already completed Cycle 1, this should look very familiar. Either way, I'd still like to show you how to access the TPA Center for all the items that you need. Let's go ahead and take a look. If you're in CalStateTEACH 2.0, this site should look familiar. This is your homepage. And in order to access the TPA Center, you simply go down towards the left below Webmail and click on the TPA Center. And within the TPA Center, you will see exactly what I shared in that screenshot on the previous screen, which are all of the templates and resources that you need in order to successfully complete CalTPA. Now, if you are in the 3.0 program, this home screen should look familiar. And all you need to do here in order to access the TPA Center is go to the Resources tab that's right here. Looks like a folder. And you go down to the TPA Center. And it's going to redirect you to the 2.0 world, which looked just like the previous screen I shared with you. And so here is the TPA Center. So you can see here's the assessment guide. So that overview document I just showed you is found inside of the assessment guide for Cycle 2. The assessment guide also goes over step by step everything that you need to do for CalTPA Cycle 2, and it also has the rubrics for you to look at. The templates are accessible here. So you click on the triangle and you can see all of the templates that you will need. The templates are required. You cannot create your own templates. So this is where you come to get them. The timelines that you'll be using, it can be found here for each cycle. The flashes that you'll be asked to reference from your timeline document are found here. Scroll down a little. The evidence charts. This is a very key resource for you to be able to access. The evidence charts provide you with specific information regarding the file types you're allowed to use and the file size, and even down to the font and the font size you're allowed to use for each document or video that you submit for CalTPA. So you should always come back to reference these evidence charts whenever you're working on your CalTPA pieces. The only piece that you do not see in here at this point is the link to the videos, but those links will be there shortly. It will have its own tab, its own triangle that you can click, and you will see all of the videos for the coaching sessions for CalTPA right here in the TPA Center. And then the last piece are the video permission forms. If you've already completed Cycle 1, you're familiar with this. These are the same video forms that you used for your work in the classroom for CalStateTEACH. So if you've already submitted these, if you've already collected them from the students in your classroom, then you're covered and you don't have to worry about collecting another set of permission slips. And you just want to hold on to the copy for your reference, just in case, until after you receive your results from CalTPA. Now let's go ahead and go back to our PowerPoint. Here we are. We are going to begin looking at step 1, which is the plan step. Now, if you remember back when you did cycle 1, you only had to create 1 lesson. Now for cycle 2, we are going to be creating a series of lessons. And what they consider a series of lessons is 3 lessons. 3 to 5 lessons, but let's just focus on 3 for now. 3 lessons, and then you will be doing a reteach or an extension lesson as well. So ultimately you'll end up with 4 lessons. But for the learning segment template that you'll be completing, you will be doing 3 lessons. Okay? And again, the focus is literacy. So you will need to talk to your mentor teacher at your school site to find out what series of lessons you can teach. And the focus for this is on assessment. You are going to be teaching the lessons, and you're going to be embedding informal, formal, and student self-assessments into each of the lessons for this learning cycle. In order to do that, you need to have the conversation with your site mentor, and you also need to think a little bit further and deep about what the lessons are that you're planning in order to be able to embed those types of assessments. And you will be taking one of the sets of assessment results, looking at them and determining, who's getting it, who's not getting it, where do I need to go next from here? So ultimately, the purpose of CalTPA Cycle 2 is to showcase how well you can create multiple types of assessments and evaluate those assessments and determine your next steps based on your assessment results. So there are 2 documents you need to complete to just start off with the this Cycle 2 Step 1 process. And those are the contextual information template and the learning segment template. The contextual information template looks like this. Let me show you. And if you already completed Cycle 1 and you are with the same group of students, now for Cycle 2, you are going to be able to pull some of that information that you had in your Getting to Know Your Students template from Cycle 1 and use it here. Not all of it will apply, but you will be able to do a bit of copy paste. If you're with a brand new group of students, then you will have to fill out this form from scratch. Let's go ahead and take a look at it in a little bit more of a detailed view. Let me first zoom in so we can see it a little bit better. You can see inside the green box it gives you those directions, and one of the key pieces is that this document can be up to 3 pages, so 3 pages or less. And you'll want to answer these questions for your group of learners that you're teaching in your classroom. Now, similar to Cycle 1, if you are teaching a combo class, for example, if you're teaching a 1-2 combo, you have 2 choices. You can create this series of lessons for your 1st and 2nd graders combined. So you may have standards that are coming from 1st and 2nd grade, or you can choose to only teach your 1st graders or only teach your 2nd graders. What CalTPA would like you to do is work with a group of students that you would normally work with on a day-to-day basis. So if you're normally in that classroom and teaching, when you teach literacy lessons, is it all together, both the 1st and 2nd graders, or do you separate them out? So that's a conversation that you'll need to have with your mentor teacher as well in order to determine the best way to establish what group of students you'll work with. If you're not working in a combo class, you will want to work with your whole class of students. And for this first prompt, what you are going to do is provide a description of the student's assets and needs. This should be familiar because it's something that you had to do when you did Cycle 1. So the first question is, what are their assets and needs related to the prior academic knowledge for this learning goal? So related to literacy and whatever concept you're teaching in literacy, what's their prior academic knowledge? What are they bringing to this lesson? What do they already know? What do they still need to work on? Okay, what are their assets? What are their needs related to that prior academic learning? And then also their English language proficiency levels. And this is both for your standard English learners and your English language learners. Where are they? Okay, where are they related to this content level? What's their level of proficiency with literacy? The next piece, the cultural and linguistic resources and funds of knowledge. So what are your students bringing to the table? This is going to be maybe more specific to groups of learners, right? What do they know? What have they learned at home? What is their background? What is their experience that is going to help them do well with this literacy concept you're teaching? And what are some things that they're bringing that may cause them to struggle a little bit that you need to be aware of when it comes time to plan your lessons? The next piece, what is their prior experiences and interests related to the content you plan to teach? This takes getting to know your students. And at this point, I would hope that you've had enough time in the classroom where you've been able to develop those relationships with your students and really know who they are, not only academically, but who they are personally. Who are they outside of school? What are they like? What is their home life like? What are their interests? What are their aspirations? So you want to take that information to help you answer this prompt as to what experiences and their interests and how does that relate to the content you're teaching? What are the strengths and the assets that they're bringing for this content, and what's something that they may need to work on a little bit more because of what you know? And then the last prompt, what is their experience using educational technology? It could be the assistive technologies, such as if a student has to have hearing aids and you use a device for that, or maybe they have some sort of computer system that assists them with typing because it's something they're struggling with, whatever assistive technologies they may have in the classroom or outside of the classroom. So what experience do you know that your students have? What are the assets with that? What do they know? I mean, these students of ours, they come with so much knowledge related to technology. What do they know and how are you going to use that to your advantage, right? And then maybe they have some needs related to the technology too. Maybe they're not using it as often as we would hope or think that they are. The next prompt that you're going to complete is more the nuts and bolts, the contextual information for the class. So what grade level, what's the content area? We know we're doing literacy, right? And then your classroom setting typically is going to be a face-to-face setting. And then what educational technology is accessible? Because here's the thing, with CalTPA Cycle 2, you are required to have educational technology built into the lessons that you create. You will score an OK score if it's the teacher using the technology. You will score a higher score on the rubric if it's actually the students using the technology to advance their learning. So you want to talk about what type of technology is accessible to the students in your classroom. And then we need to know the number of students. Overall, English learners, standard English learners, students with IEP or 504, and then those who are GATE. And then if you're working in a dual language setting, you need to identify, is it bilingual, one-way immersion, or two-way immersion? And then your topic of content-specific instruction and assessment sequence. So this is where you're going to give a brief overview of what it is you're planning to teach for literacy and what assessments are you planning to use. Just a brief overview for this one, because remember, we can't go beyond 3 pages, and you're going to be able to get deeper when we get to the next template. Now let's go ahead and look at the learning segment template. This is where you're actually going to write out your lesson plan ideas. Instead of using the CalStateTEACH lesson plan, you're required to use the one that's provided by CalTPA. And here's what it looks like. Okay. So you can see it has those directions up here, and there is not a page limit for this one, so you can make it put as much information as you need to in order to put every bit of information that you need to about your lessons. But you can see it says that it wants to know about the standards that you're addressing, the goals, what is your evidence and your assessments that you're providing to the students. And then this is an interesting one, how does it fit? Include an explanation of how each lesson links to where students are currently at, right? And how the lessons build on each other. So that's an important piece. You don't want to be teaching these lessons in isolation, right? It's a unit. And so day 1 should be necessary in order to get to day 2. And day 2 should be necessary in order to get to day 3. Okay? So you want to talk about how your lessons are building on each other. And then you're also going to talk about the learning activities. What are the students going to be doing during the lesson? The strategies you're planning to use during the lesson, and the ELD or ALD, academic language development is ALD. What are you doing for ELD and ALD in each lesson? And then what are the adaptations and accommodations you're making within each lesson? Because we know that you should have EL learners, you might have GATE students, you may have students with IEP or 504 plan, you may just have some struggling readers, you may have some struggling writers. It depends what you're teaching as to who you're going to highlight. But there should be students in your class that you need to make adaptations, accommodations, or supports for during each step of the lesson. Just like what you normally do when you do your lesson planning for CalStateTEACH, how you have to include that piece. You'll be doing that here as well. When we look a little bit deeper at this document, you can see this is where you're going to talk about what your topic is and what grade level you're teaching it to, what's the standard or standards you're using for the lesson, and then what is your ELD standard? You may have to look those up, okay? And then what is your goal for the segment, your overall unit goal? So that's the bigger picture. What are you hoping your students get out of this in general? And then what are your learning goals? So this is getting into lesson 1 now. What are the learning goals specifically to lesson 1, right? So your unit goal is the big picture. Then when you get to lesson 1, you're talking about specifically in lesson 1, what is your goal, okay? You can also frame it as an objective. After doing something, students will be able to do something and put that strong observable verb in there. And then you also need to put in the evidence and assessments of learning, right? So here you can see it says informal, student self, and formal assessment. There's your clue there. You should have informal assessment, right? Maybe it's a thumbs up, thumbs down. It's a whiteboard holding it up. You need some sort of informal assessments, maybe more than one, built into each lesson. And then you also need a student self-assessment built into each lesson. And I know during your time in the program, you have had experience identifying and looking at and practicing with student self-assessments. So in each lesson, the goal is that you will build a student self-assessment into the lesson. And then you have some sort of formal assessment. Typically that's found towards the end of the lesson, where you're determining, okay, what did we learn from this lesson? Who's got it? Who needs more time? Who needs more support? That all these boxes expand, by the way. So as you type, they will get bigger and you'll take up more space. And then here is where you're going to say how your lesson links to the prior learning. So this is where you can say prior to this unit, right? Or prior to this lesson, maybe you're doing 3 lessons that come from the middle of the unit, and that's okay too, right? This isn't a whole unit, it's just 3 lessons coming out from a unit. You can talk about what they were doing previously that's leading them up to this lesson content. Again, this is just lesson 1, okay? And then what learning activities? And you can see here the big piece, where appropriate, how you and your students will use educational technology. Now I'm telling you, in order to score a 2 or higher, you need to have educational technology built into the lessons. So the best thing you can do for yourself is make sure that you have educational technology written into your lesson plan. And you'll see when we get to step 2, one of your video clips is the evidence of educational technology being used in the classroom. So this is the point where you need to think, if you don't have educational technology in the classroom, what can you get access to quick? The first thing that comes to my mind is, if you don't have anything in your classroom, go to the computer lab. If you have a computer lab at your school, do your lessons in the computer lab, or you're using the technology and students are using the technology. Or if you have the cart that has the Chromebooks or the iPads on it, request to have access to use those during your lesson so that you have that in your lesson, because you're not going to score 2 or higher unless you have it. So it's very important. But other than the ed technology, you also want to talk about the other activities that your students are doing, right? They're not only going to be using technology during the lesson, but there will be activities that you need to list, just like you would during a normal lesson plan. And then what strategies will you be using, right, throughout? Think about the beginning, middle, and end of the lesson. What strategies, specific strategies, are you planning to implement in order for your students to have success? And then what are you doing for English language development and academic language development, right? Maybe related to the vocabulary or using realia. What are we doing, right, to help our students with English language development? And those who are struggling with academic language, what are you doing to help support them to understand this literacy academic language? The next box, what are your adaptations and accommodations for students with specific learning needs? So I recommend breaking this down. So for example, if you want to say your EL learners, and maybe you have a variety of levels of EL learners, you can talk about each level of learners and how you're doing something different for each of them in this lesson. Okay, and then you can talk about your other groups of learners. Maybe you have a GATE cluster, and so you have a few GATE students. What are you doing for them? This is where you'll want to put in each type of learners that you're planning to reference, those learners that you included in your context information on that previous document I shared with you. Whoever you included there, you need to talk about here. And then here you can see at the completion of lesson 1, based on what you learned as a result of teaching this lesson, what changes, if any, will you make to the next lesson? So this is the box you're going to wait to complete until after you actually teach the lessons. And that's something that's new and different for us. Usually when we fill out lesson plans, we do it all before, right? But this is almost like the reflection piece that we do after a lesson. So after you implement lesson 1, you need to remember to come back here and say, what are you going to change because of what you actually did when you taught lesson 1? And then you'll see when it comes to lesson 2 and lesson 3, it's all the exact same prompts. The only thing that changes is that it says, at the completion of lesson 2 and at the completion of lesson 3, based on what you learned, what changes would you make? And you can see that they only give you room for the 3 lessons. So that's why I say, just do 3 lessons. You can, it says add rows if needed for additional lessons, but my best recommendation is keep it simple and keep it to the 3 lessons. Why not? Now let's get back to this. And here's some tidbits for success as well. You can see in here, and so this is just to recap kind of what we said. When you're doing that learning segment template, your literacy lessons have to support the academic language development of your students, right? So that's why there's that box, the ELD and the ALD. What are you doing to support those students so they're successful with learning the academic language needed for your literacy lessons? And then see, include that ed tech, don't forget the ed tech. And then when you're completing the template, you're also going to be describing the assets and needs of everyone. And here's a big one that you need to think about and make sure that you incorporate. I would put these questions into your lesson plan templates that you're making. It said that your lesson plan should encourage students to engage in higher order thinking as they develop a deep understanding of the content and academic language. So you need to think, how are you going to get your students to higher order thinking? Are there certain questions you're going to be asking in order to probe and prompt? If so, put those questions in to your lesson segment template, because if you don't write them down, they're not going to show up in your videos. And I'm going to tell you as another sneak preview, in cycle 2, step 2, you will have to show evidence of students engaged in higher order thinking. So if you don't plan that out in these lesson segment templates, it is not going to happen. So please plan it out. Now here's another piece, the assessment descriptions template. Because if you recall, I said cycle 2, the focus is on assessment, the informal, formal, and self-assessment, and how you use that information to help drive your instruction. So there's a whole template just for your assessments. And let's take a look at it. And you can see that this template can be up to 5 pages in length. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're working on it. Now, you can see it's broken down into the 3 sections: informal assessment, student self-assessment, and then formal assessment. So let's first take a look at the informal assessment section. The first prompt asks, describe 1 informal assessment you plan to implement and the corresponding criteria. The corresponding criteria would be the rubric that you've created or the checklist that you've created for students as you're evaluating their assessment, okay? So a rubric, a checklist, or it could be a criteria sheet as well, okay? So it should be one of those 3 things. And I'm going to give you some guidance and say the best thing that you could do is have that strong informal assessment in every lesson and have a criteria sheet, a check sheet, or a rubric for each of them. And this is for the just in case situation. If for some reason you have to do a retake, you want to have as many pieces saved and as many strong assessments saved as possible in case of a retake situation. So you're going to describe only 1 of your informal assessment. So pick your best one. Pick the best informal assessment that you've planned, and you're going to talk about it. What are you having students do for that informal assessment, and what is their criteria? How are you evaluating them on that assessment? And then you explain how the informal assessment is aligned to the content-specific student learning goals. So you need to be very explicit. How is this assessment tied to what the goal is for the lesson? Any assessment you give should be tied to the goal, correct? If the goal is for students to be able to write a rough draft of a 5-paragraph essay, then the assessment should be the rough draft of the 5-paragraph essay. And your rubric that you create should be a rubric that evaluates students on that and provides evidence for what students did on that rough draft of that 5-paragraph essay. So you're going to explain specifically and explicitly how this specific informal assessment is tied to the goals that you have for the lesson, and how the assessment will provide students opportunities to demonstrate content knowledge in a variety of different ways. So that's another key thing that you have to keep in mind, that you need to have multiple ways for students to be able to demonstrate their understanding and their knowledge, because we know not all students learn the same. So you need to think about that when you're planning your informal assessments and your formal assessments. How are you going to create assessment that could meet the multiple needs of students and assess them in a variety of different ways so that you're reaching all of your learners? And the next piece that you'll be answering is identify what you will look for in the student responses to the selected informal assessment and how you plan to monitor students' understanding of content during the learning sequence. So two things going on there. What are you looking for, right? That criteria sheet or that rubric should help drive what you are looking for in the student responses, okay? And it could be that it's questions. It could be that they're actually physically writing or doing something. Whatever it is, you need to have some sort of criteria for what you're looking for when you look at it. Not just, oh, it's all fantastic, right? Oh, they all get it. No, you need to be able to know for each individual, do they get it or do they not, and have that criteria for it. And how do you plan to monitor students' understanding during this learning sequence? Is it just going to be a whole class check? Oh yeah, I think they get it. No, that's not going to work, right? You need to have understanding for each individual student. So how are you going to monitor that in order to ensure that you know right where every student is when you're giving them these assessments and when you're working through the lesson that you're teaching? And then it says, if you're planning to provide instructional adaptations or accommodations, explain why. Why are you providing those adaptations or accommodations? This is where you get to talk about those individual or groups of learners and what they need and why you're doing it. So that's just for the informal assessment. Now let's look at the student self-assessment. It says, describe how you will engage students in self-assessment or reflection and the criteria you will provide to students to guide their evaluation of their own learning. This could take on many forms, but the one thing a self-assessment cannot be is students' feelings on how they're doing. Oh, I'm feeling good. This feels great. I think I did great at that. No, it should be that they're using the same criteria. Typically, they're using the same or similar criteria sheet, check sheet, or rubric that you've created to self-assess their own work. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you had students write a rough draft of a 5-paragraph essay. Of course, you gave them that rubric ahead of time, so they knew exactly what they needed to be sure to include in that 5-paragraph essay, right? That's what you're holding them to. And then, hey, tell them to use that rubric to now self-assess what they did in their writing. Okay, they should go through and mark themselves. Where do I think I fall based on how I wrote this and what I did? Where's my evidence that shows how I did using the rubric? Okay, so you need to describe how you are going to have students complete that self-assessment and what you're having them use in order to self-assess themselves. Then you explain how the student self-assessment aligned to the content-specific learning goal. So again, how is that self-assessment you're giving your students connect to what your goal was for the lesson? Well, if you're using the same criteria, rubric, or assessment sheet that you're planning for the whole lesson that's tied directly to the objective and to the standards, then should logically connect to the student self-assessment as well. But you're going to explain, be explicit, right? Even if it seems like, oh, the scorer should know this if they just look at it, explain it. Pretend like the scorer can't even see the pieces that you're sharing. How does that self-assessment connect to the goals of the lesson? And then the last part of it is, how will it provide, so how will that self-assessment provide opportunities for students to reflect on and advance their understanding of the content? Okay, so how is it allowing them to understand where they're at and where they need to go in relation to the goals and the standards for that literacy lesson that you're teaching? Because it's important for students to know that here's where I'm at. Here's what I'm doing well. Here's what I'm struggling with. Here's where I need to go next. And then again, similar to the informal assessment, if you're providing any adaptations or accommodations for the student self-assessment, you need to state what those accommodations or adaptations are and why you're doing it. And then the last part is the formal assessment. So you're going to answer these 3 prompts. What learning goals are measured by the formal assessment? So you should have learning goals set for the lesson. That's what should be assessed from your formal assessment. Whatever your learning goal is, that's what you're assessing students on. If the learning goal was that students were going to be able to write a rough draft of a 5-paragraph essay, just like I said, then guess what? Your formal assessment is assessing students on how well they wrote the rough draft of their 5-paragraph essay. So you're going to explain that. And then the next, what evidence are you collecting to observe each student to determine that the specific learning goals described in the scoring criteria have been met? So what formal assessment are you collecting from students? What are you having them do that you are going to be able to look at and evaluate using either that rubric, checklist, or criteria sheet? What are you looking at that you're going to be able to evaluate that hopefully they used a self-assessment to evaluate as well? And then the last part, how will you use your rubric or criteria to define or identify successful evidence that students have achieved the learning goal? So you've created that rubric, that checklist, or that criteria sheet that should allow you to tell students what they did well and what they need to work on in relation to the standard and to the goal of the lesson. Okay, just like I said, if you created the rubric for writing the rough draft, then you're going to explain how you're using that rubric to share how students are achieving the goals or not achieving the goals of the lesson. And then this should be similar because we said this for the informal and for the student self-assessment. How will you provide adaptations or accommodations as appropriate during the formal assessment to address the individual student learning needs? You need to think about those individuals and groups of learners and what sort of adaptations or accommodations will you be providing in order to help them be successful and still meet the same learning goals during the course of the lesson. Now we can take a look at the first rubric that's tied to step 1 planning for cycle 2. Just like with cycle 1, only a level 2 is needed on each rubric in order to pass. But of course we want to try to reach level 4 because it is good teaching practice to be at level 4. But here's what level 2 says. That your learning goals in the learning segment are loosely based on students' prior content knowledge, and modeling or scaffolding is not clearly described. So your goals do not fully align with the standards and what you're actually teaching during the lesson, and that you're not modeling for your students, you're not showing them what they need to be doing, and you're not scaffolding that instruction to help meet the needs of all the learners in the classroom. It also says that your assessments check for rote knowledge, right? True, false, fill in the bubble, very simplistic, right? Rote knowledge of content, or that your assessments are only partially connected to the learning goal. We don't want that. Your assessment should be assessing the learning goal in its entirety. And then your student grouping within the learning segment may not be conducive to the type of lessons being planned, and reasonable rationale is not provided. So maybe what you're teaching if you're doing your groupings, like if you decide, oh, I'm doing this whole thing, whole class, that may not be appropriate, right? There may be times when it's more beneficial to be doing some partner work or some collaborative group work than just doing everything whole class and lecturing at your students, because we know that's not the most effective way for students to learn. But if you have some goals that are loosely connected to what students are doing, and you have assessments that check for rote knowledge and your groupings are inappropriate, it's still a level 2 and still passing currently for CalTPA. But let's look at a level 4, because that's where we want to be for good teaching practice. Level 4, you need to have all of level 3 plus this piece of level 4. So it says that your learning segment includes manageable and appropriate learning goals that clearly build on students' prior knowledge. So it's connected to what they did previously. You're going to do that. And that you clearly identify the multiple kinds of evidence they will look for to determine that students met the learning goals and the assessments they will use to make this determination. So it means that you have multiple types of informal assessment built into your lesson, multiple types of activities built into your lesson to help determine and help students access the content and help determine who gets it and who needs more support. And that your learning segment includes learning activities that are appropriately engaging, challenging, and accessible for all students, and grouping strategies are appropriate. So you're differentiating instruction during your learning segment in order to meet the needs of individual learners, which this is what you had to do in cycle 1. So you're just carrying over that knowledge you gained that you've had this whole time you've been in the program, but that you were evaluated on during cycle 1, right? Being able to differentiate instruction. You're carrying that over here to cycle 2 as well. How are you able to differentiate instruction to meet the needs of all the learners in your classroom? The other piece is that your content-specific instructional strategies, so the strategies you're using that are specific to these literacy lessons, right, that are not strategies that you can do in math or in science or in social studies, but that you need to use to teach literacy lessons, include adaptations and accommodations that will assist students to reach learning goals in multiple ways. So remember how I said we all learn in different ways. You know this, it's been a part of our program where we've talked about that. So how are you going to meet the needs of your students who learn in multiple ways? You need all of that plus this piece in order to score level 4. That you also have instruction and assessment that are purposely chosen and planned to develop deep understanding of the content through active learning and the academic language to support students to meet in multiple ways the content-specific learning goals. So you have very specific assessments that are clearly aligned to what the goals are for the lesson, and that you have the supports in there for ELD learners and for your academic language needs as well, okay, in order to help all students understand the academic language that's built into literacy. Let's keep going. Here's the next rubric, tied again to cycle 2, step 1 for planning. Let's look at that level 2 because we know that's passing. It says the assessments that you've created, including the rubric or criteria sheet or check sheet, the assessments, activities, and strategies from the learning segment are partially aligned in ways that could limit students' access to learning. So it means your assessments and your activities and the strategies you're using are a bit disconnected. Doesn't all make sense and doesn't all tie together in a nice pretty package. That's a level 2. Let's look at level 4 because that's where we want to be. Level 2 you'll still pass, but let's aim for the 4. So it says the assessments, learning activities, and instructional strategies for each lesson are aligned to meet the learning goals. Of course, that's what we want. That's good teaching practice. And that the lessons build on one another, right? That's a piece that you're supposed to include in that lesson template, is how does this lesson build from the previous lesson? So the lessons build on one another to develop students' higher order thinking skills. Remember I told you, you need to make sure that that's embedded into your lesson plans, because not only do you need it here in order to get a 3 or a 4, but you also need it in step 2 in order to even get a 2. So let's have it be here in your lesson plans. So how do you have higher order thinking skills built into your lessons? Okay, and academic language and concepts and skills that are likely to support students to engage with the learning segment content. So how are you supporting students through higher order thinking and their academic language development and these tricky concepts or skills that they're going to be learning in literacy? in order to lead them to success and to learn what it is you're trying to have them learn during the segment. You need that, and then you also need what's written here in order to get the 4. That your learning segment plan builds in opportunities that provide multiple access points. And look here, it gives you more specifics, different ways to learn the content. More examples, it could be visually, through writing or reading, acting out, listening, verbalizing. Think about all those different ways. Try and use multiples of these in order to ensure that you're meeting the needs of all of the types of learners in your classroom. So you build in opportunities that provide multiple access points to learning the content and multiple modes to demonstrate learning content. So they're writing, they're speaking, they're, like it says here, they could be performing. Okay? They're creating something. Those are different modes to show their understanding of the content. And that will get you at a level 4. You will be using a rubric, right? As I've made very clear, a rubric or scoring criteria or check sheet to access the qualities of your student work. And you're going to use this to share the results of your analysis with students through detailed feedback that they will use to advance their learning. So not only are you using this rubric or check sheet or scoring criteria for students to maybe self-assess and for you to evaluate their work, but you're also using it as an avenue to provide very detailed, specific feedback to the students regarding what they're doing well and what they need to improve upon in order to advance their learning. Along with the other templates that you're submitting, those 3 templates I've shown you so far, you're also submitting a blank copy of the formal assessment and the rubric or scoring criteria that you plan to use. Okay, so that rubric, scoring criteria, checklist that you're using, along with your completed learning segment template. So here's the evidence that needs to be submitted. Just to recap, make sure that we're all on the same page. You're going to submit, for step 1, your contextual information template. It's up to 3 pages. You're going to submit the learning segment template. Remember, there's no page limit on that, so you can make it as detailed as you want to, because that is going to be your aid when you're actually implementing the lessons. So make them as detailed as you need to. Script it, whatever you need to do in order to ensure that you'll be successful when we get to step 2 and we're implementing. The other piece is your assessment descriptions, right? That document we just looked at that had the informal self and formal assessment that can be up to 5 pages. And then you're going to submit a blank copy of the assessment, the formal assessment. You can see it doesn't want all of them, just your formal assessment. And then a copy of the formal assessment rubric or criteria sheet. Remember, this is before you're implementing, so it all should be blank copies of everything. Once you have completed each of these pieces and you're ready, you need to share your step 1 documents with your faculty and with your collaborative group in order to receive feedback before moving on to step 2. I hope you have a great day. That's the end of our discussion for Cycle 2, Step 1 plan.